Okay, there we go. Okay. Just a moment. Going to admit some more folks that came in. Okay. Today we're going to hear from Mary Stanton, who is the author of a book, From Selma to Sorrow, The Life and Death of Viola Liuzzo and Journey Toward Justice, Juliet Hampton Morgan, and the Montgomery bus boycott. She's taught at the University of Idaho, the College of St. Elizabeth in New Jersey, and Rutgers University. And she's a noted chronicler of social justice movements in the South, exploring resources available to Depression-era communists before the advent of the New Deal and the modern civil rights movement. And so I know that she will have a lot to tell us about Juliet Morgan. Okay. So I am going to turn it over to Mary.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, and welcome. I want to thank you all for this kind invitation and the opportunity to share some of the life and work of Juliet Morgan. She's someone that I discovered more than 30 years ago after reading Dr. Martin Luther King's memoir, Stride Toward Freedom. This is his account, you'll remember, of the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. I thought I knew the whole story about Rosa Parks and E.D. Nixon and Ralph Abernathy and Dr. King himself, but I'd never heard of Juliet Morgan. And I was surprised to learn that she was a white woman who had lived her entire life in Montgomery. Dr. King wrote, quote, about a week after the protest, and he always called the boycott, whenever he referred to it, he called it the protest. About a week after the protest started, a white woman who understood and sympathized with the Negroes' efforts wrote a letter to the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, comparing the bus protest with the Gandhian movement in India. Juliet Morgan, sensitive and frail, did not long survive the rejection and condemnation of the white community. But before she died in the summer of 1957, the name Mahatma Gandhi was well known in Montgomery. Who was she? I really wanted to know, and so I found out. By the time I learned about Juliet Morgan, I'd already written 2 biographies of white civil rights activists, Viola Liuzzo from Detroit and William Moore from Binghamton, New York, both Yankees. Juliet was a genuine white Southerner on both sides of her family, born and bred in the cradle of the Confederacy, Montgomery, Alabama. Now, there's a portrait of Juliet. Can we get that up?
Sure, you want me, I'll just start your
Yes, that would.
slides. There they are.
Okay, that would be true. Are you going to work them from your end, or have I got them?
I think I'll have to, yes.
Okay, sorry. Okay. All right, so here, let me see. Yeah, let's go to the second one, the portrait of Juliet. Yeah, here she is in 1938. Every aspect of Juliet's upbringing, her social class, her education, especially her temperament, mitigated against her ever becoming a passionate supporter of the Montgomery bus boycott. Yet that is exactly what she did. And there you see. Okay.
If you go to the beginning, Joanne, then people could see the whole picture. Go to slideshow and beginning, please. Keep going to the right, further right. The very top line says slideshow. No, okay, one down, I'm sorry. Now go over, please, left, left. Keep going, slideshow, right there. If you click that and then go from beginning, or play from start is in the one line down.
Oh,
There.
that's great. Great.
There
Thank
it
you.
is.
Terrific.
Sorry for the interruption.
No,
That's okay.
Now you just have to click it each time. Mary will just have to tell
Yes.
you when she wants the next slide.
okay, that's good. There she is. Whoops. Okay. Born.
There.
There's little Juliet. Born on February 21st, 1914. She was the only child of Francis Perryman Morgan, who was a traveling dry goods salesman, and Lila Bess Olin, a liberated Southern belle who traveled in the circles in Montgomery with Zelda Fitzgerald and Tallulah Bankhead. Juliet's paternal great-great-grandfather was a Georgia state senator, and her great-grandfather on her mother's side was a nephew of the Revolutionary War hero, General Wade Hampton Sr. General Hampton's grandson, Wade Hampton III, became a legendary Confederate general, a United States senator, and governor of South Carolina. Juliet's maternal grandmother, Juliet Olin, was a proud member of both the Daughters of the American Revolution and the Cradle of Confederacy chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Oops. So here's Juliet's mother, and you can see she's got quite the attitude, and that is what Juliet had to contend with. They had a very, very difficult relationship. Her father, as a salesman, his great hope was to become governor of Alabama. He was very interested in politics, and she was closest to her grandmother. Can we go to the next? There we go. And here's Big Mama. Big Mama was her mother's mother, her grandmother, and Juliet and Big Mama adored each other. And this is a strange slide. I realized she's standing on a pedestal, and the two of them are gazing at each other. They were very close all through their lives. What Juliet's mother was not able to give her, her grandmother, who she called Big Mama, certainly was able to provide. Juliet's childhood was filled with the usual Sunday school picnics and Confederate Memorial Day parades and piano, dance, and deportment lessons. She graduated from Sydney Lanier High School in 1930, and we have a slide of what she looked like. Yeah, very pretty girl. She majored in English and political science at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And in there, she earned a master's degree and taught English composition and American literature for 1 year before returning to Montgomery, and that would be in 1937. Go to the next one, please. There she is. There she's in Montgomery in 1937. For the following decade, Juliet taught English at Lanier High School in Montgomery, where she also had gone to high school. She tutored, she coached drama, she worked in a bookstore, and finally as a librarian for both the Carnegie and the Montgomery City Public Libraries. In 1955, she would be appointed director of the City Library's Research Department. So that was in 1937. We go to the next one, please. Here, in most ways, the adult Juliet was a typical middle-class white Southern woman. She enjoyed parties and entertaining. She loved literature and theater and music, and she lived at home with her widowed mother and her adored grandmother. One thing and it seemed like a very small thing at the time, was her inability to drive a car. Juliet suffered from tremendous anxiety and later depression, and she could not bring herself to control a car. So unlike most of her contemporaries, she used the city buses to commute to and from work because these disabling anxiety attacks that she had prevented her from pursuing a driver's license. It was while riding the buses and watching Black men and women who paid the same 10-cent fare that she did be humiliated and threatened by the white drivers that Juliet literally learned. There it was when Juliet learned the price of a white racial preference. And it's always been interesting to me that she was on the buses where her sensitivity for the civil rights movement started. So she saw things that people of her own class did not see because they stayed away from the buses. And that's where she got her mission, in a place where she was because she couldn't drive a car. There's something interesting in that. You have the next one, please. Thank you. As early as 1939, 16 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, Juliet wrote letters to the editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. And here is the son of the first editor of the Montgomery Advertiser. Hello? Grover Hall Jr. And he and Juliet had been in high school together. And by this time, 1939, he had inherited editorship of the paper from his father, and she was working in the library. By 1936, Juliet had joined a United Church Women's Interracial Prayer Group, where she met Black female working women, including later Coretta Scott King, who shared her passion for politics and music and religion. These women's taxes supported the state and municipal institutions like the public library, yet they were denied access because of their race. In post-World War II Montgomery, segregation was a thoroughly mainstream practice, and white supremacy was a natural part of living. For white people, it was as natural as eating, sleeping, or breathing. It was what one did. Signs in downtown shops and restaurants warned, "We do not welcome the colored." And most whites considered that they were entitled to Black deference. White knowledge of Black life was often limited to conversations with yard men, cooks, and maids. Most whites professed to believe that Black people did not consider Jim Crow segregation particularly oppressive. In 1946, however, something extraordinary got into Juliet Morgan. Next slide, please. An admirer of Mahatma Gandhi who had won freedom for his countrymen using nonviolent civil disobedience against the British Crown, Juliet began a one-woman nonviolent protest campaign against the racist practices on the Montgomery city buses. One morning on her way to work, as she watched a Black woman pay her fare and leave the bus to enter by the back door, as required, only to have the bus driver pull away and leave her standing there. Juliet had seen this happen before. It was nearly as common as bus drivers refusing to make change for Black passengers or throwing their change on the floor. This particular morning, however, Juliet jumped up and she pulled the emergency cord. When the driver stopped, she demanded that he open the back door and let that Black woman on board. No one, Black or white, could believe what had just happened. After that, Juliet pulled the stop cord every time she witnessed an abuse and demanded to be let off the bus. If a driver ordered Blacks to get on back there, or if he cursed them or told them to give up those seats in the back, to white passengers, she'd pull the cord and demand that he stop the bus. Word quickly spread throughout Montgomery about the white librarian's strange behavior. Drivers baited her by provoking situations 10 or 12 blocks from her stop. She often walked a mile or more to get to work or back home. As she was leaving the bus, many white passengers would laugh at her. Her mother assured her that she was making a fool of herself and that she wouldn't be satisfied until every respectable white person in Montgomery shunned her. Now you have to remember that her mother was a would-be Southern belle, and that's exactly what she wanted for her daughter. She didn't want an intellectual child. She didn't want a sensitive child. She wanted a great beauty who would bring her how can I say this? Who would be socially accepted in a way that Juliet could never be. So not everyone would shunned her, as her mother told her they would. She got some support from a new man in town, the Reverend Dr. Thomas Robinson Thrasher, a 35-year-old classic scholar and the new rector of the Episcopal Church of the Ascension in Cloverdale. The Church of the Ascension was where the Morgans were members. And then we can go ahead to the next slide. I tried very hard to get a picture. There's Mahatma Gandhi. We can go to the next one too. Here we go. I tried very hard to find a picture of Tom Thrasher, and there wasn't one to be had on the internet. But he was a very kind and very classical scholar of a young man. He was a native of Mississippi, and he believed that it was impossible for Blacks to expect social and economic emancipation in white society by trusting in the moral sense of the white race. He had no, he knew that whites were at this point culturally not willing to accept Blacks as equals. And so he described his personal calling as an Episcopalian priest as an attempt to change white hearts. He had read Juliet's letter in the Montgomery Advertiser, where she had asked, "Are white people really naive enough to believe that Black people are happy, grateful to be pushed around and told that they are inferior and ordered to move on back or get off the bus? They may take it for a long time, but not forever," she wrote. In December 1955, we can go to the next slide, I think. There we go. At the start of the city's famous bus boycott, Juliet wrote to the Montgomery Advertiser again, quote, "One feels that history is being made in Montgomery these days, the most important in her career. It's hard to imagine a soul so dead, a heart so hard, a vision so blinded and provincial as not to be moved with admiration of the quiet dignity, discipline, and dedication with which the Negroes have conducted their boycott. This was an extraordinary thing for a white person, especially a white woman, to say, and to say so publicly." And Juliet was the first to draw an analogy between the boycott and Mahatma Gandhi's use of nonviolent civil disobedience. Martin Luther King Jr. gives her credit for that in his book, Stride Toward Freedom, his account of the boycott written in 1957. In 1955, Professor L.D. Reddick, who chaired the history department at the Black Alabama State University, remembered Juliet's letter as an inspiration. "Up until that time," Dr. Reddick said, "expressions from white people had been to belittle the protest. They said it wouldn't last long and that it didn't really mean anything. Her letter grasped the significance of it and helped give many people a sense of history." Juliet's letters, as well as her association with those who opposed segregation, people like the white Montgomeryans Aubrey Williams, Clifford and Virginia Durr, Will Sheehan, and the Reverend Thomas Thrasher, identified her as an extremist. While it seems absurd to call the soft-spoken church-going librarian who lived with her mother an extremist, in 1955, her stand against segregation was indeed radical. The moderates were those whites who had no vested interest in segregation and would not fight to defend it. Now we can go to the next slide. Here we go. Here's Dr. King speaking to some of the marchers at the Hull Street Baptist Church. No, that's not, that's before the boycott. Juliet's boycott letter was the last straw for white Montgomery. Letters flooded the Montgomery Advertiser criticizing her, demanding that she be fired from the library and suggesting that she move to Harlem, New York. Throughout the ordeal, however, Juliet maintained her belief that there were many whites like herself who were opposed to segregation, but were fearful of speaking out. An extreme stand on any issue was dangerous in a society that was so focused on maintaining the status quo. Moderates were permitted to criticize Klan violence, but they were also expected to criticize the NAACP. Passionate political belief of any kind was distrusted, and that made it difficult for whites to oppose even the milder forms of segregation. Most of them had families and jobs to protect. I have many friends who share my opinions, Juliet wrote to James Dombrowski, who was then the president of the Southern Conference Education Fund. That was an interracial organization dedicated to ending segregation. There are thousands who want to change our old order, Juliet wrote to him, but they are afraid of speaking out. I believe that it is our biggest problem, overcoming the fear of decent white people. Juliet kept her job at the library only because Superintendent Dixie Lou Fisher, her boss, refused to fire her, and the Board of Trustees, in a split decision, supported Mrs. Fisher. Juliet was instructed, however, not to write any more letters to the editor if she wanted to continue working at the library. She promised to comply. In February 1956, when her alma mater, the University of Alabama, Tuscaloosa, expelled Arthur and Lucy, and I think we can go to the next slide. I think we have, yeah, there's Arthur. Its first Black undergraduate, quote, for her own safety, Juliet was appalled, but she did not pick up her pen. For more than a year, she kept her word. When the boycott ended and the city buses were integrated, Black homes and churches were bombed. The boycotters were punished economically by the White Citizens Council, and segregation was more strictly enforced in Montgomery than it had before the boycott. Still, Juliet wrote nothing. You can go to the next slide. There you go. On January 5th, 1957, however, Buford Boone, editor of the Tuscaloosa News, addressed a meeting at the White West Alabama Citizens Council, publicly charging the councilman with inflaming racial animosity. And you can see the kind of animosity. Editor Boone made an impassioned plea to the business and professional men in the ranks to demonstrate some leadership. Boone was subsequently derided as a traitor and a race mixer, but he refused to back down. He held the White Citizens Council leaders personally responsible for the violence that continued to plague Tuscaloosa a full year after Arthur and Lucy's expulsion. Juliet read Boone's speech in the library's copy of the Tuscaloosa News, and she wrote him a congratulatory note the following day. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, that's the house where Juliet and her mother lived, 30-17 Maston Lane. Okay. Boone replied on January 11, 1957, I certainly enjoyed, On January 5th, Buford Boone, editor of the Tuscaloosa News, addressed a meeting of the West Alabama White Citizens Council, and publicly charged the councilman with inflaming racial animosity. He made an impassioned plea to the business and professional men in the ranks to demonstrate some leadership. Boone was subsequently derided as a traitor and a race mixer, but he refused to back down. He held the White Citizens Council leaders personally responsible for the violence and that continued to plague Tuscaloosa after Arthur Lucy's expulsion. Juliet read Boone's speech in the library's copy of the Tuscaloosa News, and she wrote him a congratulatory note the following day. Boone replied on January 11, 1957, "I certainly enjoyed reading your letter, and I think what you said is interesting, helpful, and could provide a lot of stimulation to many of our readers." He enclosed a transcript of the keynote address delivered that night by Kurt Copeland, president of the Arkansas White Citizens Council, who had recently disrupted the peaceful integration of Hoxie High School in Lawrence County. "I shall be surprised if you are not a little more than a little sick after reading it," Boone wrote. But Copeland is an example of the rabble-rousing problem in this difficult situation. Boone also requested permission to publish Juliet's letter to him. At first, Juliet was not sure what to do. Publishing that letter would mean breaking her promise, and she would lose her job at the library. Yet she felt a personal responsibility to encourage decent whites to stand up and confront the haters and race baiters, as editor Boone had done. She wondered if her letter might inspire frightened whites to come forward and finally take a stand. Ultimately, she gave her permission for the letter to be published. And it read, quote, "There are many Southerners from various walks of life that know you were right," she said to Boone. "They know that the court is right. They know that what they call our Southern way of life must inevitably change. Many of them are even eager for it to change, but they are afraid to express themselves, so afraid to stand alone, to walk out naked. Everyone who speaks as you do, who has the faith to do what he believes is right in scorn of the consequences, does great good in preparing the way for a happier and more equitable future for all Americans. You help redeem Alabama's very bad behavior in the eyes of the nation and the world." In 1950, Juliet Morgan, a self-effacing middle-aged librarian who found it difficult to stand up to her own controlling and domineering mother, unsupported by any organization or interest group, publicly challenged and willfully provoked angry white segregationists who possessed both the power and the will to do her harm. What in the world had gotten into her? Many people asked me this question during the years when I was researching Juliet's story. I don't have an answer, but I do have a theory. The way I explain Juliet's courage is to say that she burned with the same fire that consumed the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures. That is not to say that religion drove her, but rather that she had an overwhelming passion to remedy injustice. She believed that indifference to evil was worse than evil itself. Juliet could forgive the wrongs done to her, but she did not believe she had the right to forgive wrongs done to other people. Like the prophets, she became an irritant, a conscience that disturbed and angered her neighbors. After her letter to editor Boone was published, obscene phone calls and hate mail plagued Juliet. White people boycotted the library, and teenage boys taunted and humiliated her in front of the staff. A cross was burned in front of the house she shared with her mother, and that's the house. Business and professional people who considered themselves moderates on the race issue, some of them even Juliet's friends, suspected that they'd been personally criticized in her letters. Embittered, they accused her of being mentally ill and agreed that she should be fired. Let's go to the next slide, please. Yeah, there's the library where she worked. That's the Carnegie Library. The library trustees continued to support Juliet, however, and Superintendent Fisher refused to fire her. In white activist Virginia Durr's opinion, most of Montgomery's outrage stemmed from Juliet's depiction of Southern white men, especially professional men, as moral cowards. This, Mrs. Durr said, made them determined to destroy Juliet, and she was harassed and hounded wherever she went. She became estranged from friends, former students and colleagues, neighbors, and even eventually from her mother. Ultimately, depression overwhelmed her. On July 15, 1957, she resigned her position at the library and the following morning, her mother found her unconscious in bed with an empty bottle of sleeping pills beside her. She had died during the night. Juliet Morgan was 43 years old. We'll go to the next slide, please. There she is. And she, to me, although it was many, many years ago, she looks a lot older than 43. So. A co-worker and friend from the library, Margaret McCulkin, wrote a tribute to Juliet that was published in the Montgomery Advertiser. In it, Mrs. McClurkin quotes from the work of social critic Philip Wiley, quote, "I have made the world some small bit better in my fashion. I have given you my life as an imperfect example. Pursue and enhance the best of me, for you are now in my stead." Juliet would be too modest to accept that, Mrs. McClurkin noted, but she would have liked the quotation. Go to the next slide, please. There she is on a happier day in the library. And the next one. There she is again. After Journey Toward Justice was published in 2006, people asked why I thought Juliet did what she did. I don't have an answer, but I do have a theory. And this theory was beautifully expressed by Arthur Jarvis, who's a character in Alan Patton's wonderful 1948 novel, Cry the Beloved Country. Jarvis explains his motivation as a white man who dedicated his life to extending apartheid in South Africa. "I do this not because I am a Negrophile and a hater of my own, but because I cannot find it in me to do anything else. It is the only way to end the conflict of my deepest soul. I do it because I am no longer able to aspire to the highest with one part of myself and to deny it with another. I do not wish to live like that. I would rather die than live like that. I understand better those who have died for their convictions and have not thought it was a wonderful or a brave or a noble thing to do. They died rather than live. That was all." So she's, she would say that, not because I'm courageous or honest that I do this, but it was all I could do. Can we go to the next slide, please? Here is, that's me, more than a couple of years ago. And standing next to me is Juliet's first cousin, Colonel Morgan, Colonel J.T. Morgan. And we were lucky enough to be present at the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame when Juliet Morgan was inducted on March 3rd, 2005. Go to the next one, please. And here's the whole family. This is not at the Hall of Fame, but this is actually in Montgomery, where the library in 2005 was renamed the Julia Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. And the colonel is standing behind the sign, and that's his daughter and two of Juliet's cousins. And the rest are all the Morgan relatives. It was a very wonderful day. And the next, please. Oh, that's my sister who was waiting outside the library. Next, please. And this is the Juliet Hampton Memorial Library in Montgomery, the actual place where she worked. and had her career. So she was inducted into the Alabama Women's Hall of Fame in 2004. And the following year, this library, which is located in Montgomery, was renamed the Julia Hampton Morgan Memorial Library. So she does have some memories. And that, I think, is the last one. She does have some recognition in the city of her birth, where she lived all her life. And that is Juliet Morgan. That was the life she led, the values she had. Brilliant in many ways and courageous. Courageous because she, I think as a result of a very, very domineering mother, she was a nervous soul. And yet she forced herself to do these things and for the benefit of other people. So I thank you for the invitation, and I thank you for your interest in Juliet Morgan. She's quite a person.
Well, I thank you for the presentation. It was very eye-opening to me. You know, we have heard so much always about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and, you know, there had to be white people that were helping.
Amen.
And this woman, oh my goodness, she really stuck herself out there, didn't she?
She did.
Does anyone have any questions or comments that they'd like to make? Okay, here's one. Can you read that? Do you have your chat, Mary? Can you see it?
I must be looking right at it, right?
Do you have chat open?
Oh, okay.
I think it's interesting that with her upper class white background, it was being on the bus and actually being with African Americans and seeing how they were treated that opened her conscience. And you know, it was against the law in the South in most places for white people and African Americans to be as equals anywhere. But I guess on the city bus, if they sat in the right place, they could be equals.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Well, I think it was I'm glad you said that, because honestly, that struck me from the beginning. I said, here she had this disability, she had this terrible anxiety and suffered from depression, and she couldn't drive a car because of the because of the anxiety. And where did that put her? That put her on the bus,
Right.
where it sensitized her to what was going on. And in a way, that was the beginning of what she saw and what she decided to do about it.
Here's a comment. In writing books about white civil rights activists, what are your hopes for ignorant and bigoted white people who probably will not read your books? That comes from Charlene Whitshire.
That's wonderful. Well, it's like writing books for the other side of the political.
Yeah.
They're not going to listen. They know it. They feel that the people are inferior. People were, we were all born, not all born equal, but certain people are inferior and have to be reminded of it all the time. I'm not going to convince them.
Right.
I'm not going to change their minds, maybe one or two, but if that. But I think, as you just said, there must have been more people out there, and I would rather try to dig them up and write about them and talk about what people, even with, and she had an emotional disability, she really did, what people can achieve, and changes that they can make, and celebrate that. I don't think there's anybody who is, is bigoted. I don't want to waste my time with people who are bigoted. I want to celebrate those who have been forgotten and
Amen.
talk about the work that they did.
Kathleen Nyhus said, "Thank you, Mary. Wonderful to hear of white folks who supported justice for the Black community."
Thank you.
And Tita G says, "Wonderful to know of this woman, the power of shunning clearly evident. She lived, if I heard correctly, about 3 years beyond her declaration of self."
Yes,
Glad for your book.
yes, yeah, she is about 3 years, you're correct. Thank you.
Joan Gunderson asked a question. What she did on the bus put her at tremendous risk? The bus drivers were known to be physically violent. And you brought out some of that, didn't you?
Yes. I was horrified when I read that the Black people, they took the change and they threw it on the floor.
Right.
Can you get more?
And didn't open the door even.
Slammed.
Let them on.
Well, they had to, in Montgomery in those days, they had, if you're Black, you came up the stairs in the front of the bus and put your change in, but you couldn't walk down the middle aisle. You had to go out of the bus, around, and go in the back door.
Yeah.
And that's when some of the bus drivers would have their fun, because as the person left, they'd step on the gas and go and leave them there.
And here we have someone who says, "Hello, Mary, Joan C. Browning, 1961 Freedom Rider."
Joan, yes, I know Joan. Hi, thank you for coming.
And
Thank you for what you did.
Being a freedom rider.
But this is an Episcopal women's history group. What influence or did you find that the Episcopal Church had in forming Ms. Morgan?
Well, she was a member of the Episcopal Church, and she and Tom Thrasher, who was the new priest who came there, they worked together in Montgomery. So she had him. I'm so sorry I couldn't find a picture of him. He was younger than she was, and he was a very dedicated man. It was heartbreaking that when her funeral was being held at the Church of the Ascension, where Tom Thrasher was the vicar, they wouldn't let Black people in, and a lot of especially Black women, came to the funeral, and they could stand in the as you come in, what would you call it, the lobby, but they wouldn't let them come in and sit during the service. And
well, in Selma, the Episcopal bishops of Alabama would not allow the escrew priests to come in and preach in their churches or even attend. And they expelled Father Walters, who worked with the Freedom Quilting Bee in Wilcox County. So the establishment of the Episcopal Church in that era was very white supremacist.
yeah.
As you know, the bishop was one of the people who signed the letter that Martin Luther King Jr. answered in the letter from the Birmingham jail. That was part of the criticism. But the Durrs were also members of of the Episcopal parish there, correct? Virginia Durr and
yes, and her husband.
Yeah, and they are also known for their work trying to be voices for change.
Virginia was very brave. I mean, she had a big mouth, and she certainly said what needed to be said. I have a lot of admiration for her.
Lavon Shedivi writes, "Thank you for bringing to light a truly impressive life." Kathleen, no, I think I've read, no, I haven't. Kathleen Nyhouse says, "Much of racial distress is eased through one-on-one relationships. Again, thank you. I look forward to reading your book."
Thank you.
Heather Huck says, "There's also a good book about the Black women involved, Lynn Olson, Freedom's Daughters, and also a book about King's key Black woman assistant."
Oh, good.
Tita G says, "Curious, could a picture be found in the archives of the church?"
Yes, in fact, in my book, Journey Toward Justice, I do have a picture that I got a fig of Tom Thrasher, but I couldn't get it for the slideshow, and I couldn't figure out how to do it myself. I don't think you can see it. Hold it up. You're gonna be able to see it. It's just a little, no. But he was a young, bespectacled man with a cleft in his chin. He wore glasses and he had a very high forehead. And he was a classical scholar, and he became a real support for Julia Morgan.
What happened to him?
He went and he became a chaplain at one of the big colleges. I can't remember where it was, in Baltimore, I think. He went on to have a good career as he moved up within the Anglican Church. He was soft.
Charlene Whitshire asks, he says, "Interesting. I visited Montgomery last summer with the National Union of Black Episcopalians. We worshiped at the Church of the Ascension. What a difference a few decades has made."
Good.
Yes. And Tita G says, "Thank you. Interesting, his online invisibility." Was that referring to the rector of the church?
Oh, Tom Thrasher? Yeah.
Yeah, I
I
don't
don't
know
know what happened to him.
I have something that I pulled up from the
Oh,
Episcopal
good.
News Service, and let me get
Okay.
back to that page. It was actually that he was the only white clergyman in Montgomery to support the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He lost his job there and was
Oh.
called as rector to the Chapel of the Cross in the 1960s, which is in North Carolina. In the late 1970s, Reverend Dr. Pauline Murray, the first Black woman ordained in the Episcopal Church, celebrated her first Eucharist in the old Chapel of the Cross. And so he lost his job for sticking his neck out even less far than she did, but then landed on his feet. The Holy Cross, the Chapel of the Cross at that point was a white chapel just off the UNC campus, very close to the UNC campus. But he did have he found his way towards a little bit more forgiving and Northern Territory.
Oh.
I was looking him up as we were talking here.
Saying no is always iffy. You don't know. When you say no, what will happen after that?
Heather, did you?
So she was expected as a Southern belle, or what she was supposed to be found by a man and swept off her feet, etc.
Yes.
But she stayed single. Can you talk about that, please?
Yes, she did stay single. She was full of anxiety for all of her life. She could never seemed to please her mother no matter what she did. She had her grandmother who was very close to her, the mother of her mother, and they were kind of in league together, she and
Oh.
Juliet. And then when she died, Juliet was kind of left on her own. She and her mother were always at odds. Her mother wanted a Southern belle. Her mother wanted a son-in-law and grandchildren, and she never really let up. I mean, it must have been clear to see that this young woman was just full of anxiety. And she and her mother were like oil and water.
Did you find she had bows?
No, I never found that she did. I
And
never.
yet she functioned very well as a research librarian and helped the women produce the original poster of starting the bus boycott.
Yeah.
So she was able to function in that capacity very well.
Absolutely. And she was a good teacher, she's a good librarian. I think that she was able to hold back some of that anxiety as she worked. It was good for her, the work that she did, and she was good at it. But ironically, after she died, her mother tried to make her a hero. Her mother went speaking about her, and she talked about how the hypocrites in Montgomery had killed her daughter, and
Oh my.
all the things her daughter might have liked to have heard when she was alive. Lila Beth said after she died.
Right.
She tried to keep her name alive, and to some extent she did.
Mhm.
She was difficult. Oh my, she was very difficult.
If I may add in, Daughters of the Queen, if I remember that correctly, their prayer is, I am one, but I must remember that I am one, and that I can do what I can do, and that's what matters.
That's
So
one.
I just wanted to add that part with regard to her, as she was one and did what she could do.
Yeah, she did what she could do, that's for sure.
Lynn, can you unmute?
You may have mentioned this, but how did you come upon her story yourself?
I was in Montgomery. I had written a book about Viola Liuzzo and the
March.
the march. And so I was in the library down there. It was more than a library. It was like a historical, I can't remember the name of it, but it was an institution that was both a library and a museum. And while I was there trying to find out what I could about Liuzzo, one of the librarians told me that there was one room downstairs where Juliet Morgan's, and I had no idea who Juliet Morgan was. Her mother had left all of her things from the attic in this room. And she said, had you ever heard of her? And she was telling me about the story. And it was the letters that I found. She let me look through this stuff that really grabbed me about the story. And I was able to find a woman who they gave me the name of a woman who knew Juliet Morgan very well, and she lived in Atlanta. So a couple of years later, I went to Atlanta, and ironically, this woman's mother was Juliet's best friend, and she told me wonderful things about her. She was a kid when Juliet was an adult, and Juliet was like her aunt. And she told me all kinds of stories about her mother and Juliet's friendship. And it really got me going. And Juliet's mother left everything Juliet's papers in the Montgomery Library, so I went back, and that was a great resource. Yeah,
Thank you.
Excellent.
yeah.
Well, this has been a very eye-opening, wonderful, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Mary, so much for bringing her to us.
Thank you for the
She's
invitation.
somebody we needed to know, isn't it?
She's
So
somebody we all would probably have liked to know.
that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
Did someone have something else to say?
I would just say there are other Juliets around and we need to find them
Yeah.
and support them. And I'm
Yeah.
glad her mother did what she did, and we thank you for what you've done.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for participating in this 2024 Lenten series, and thank all of you for coming and listening. We will hopefully have the all the talks up on YouTube as soon as we can. We hopefully will have another series next year, so stay tuned and tell your friends. And if you're
We do
interested
have them
in,
up. We will be able to have them up at least on Facebook where you can reach them. So
okay, well, we'll let you know through constant contact. Thank you, and if you are interested in women's history in the Episcopal Church, I would invite you to join us and come find out what EWIP is doing. It's ewhp.org. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next year. And hopefully, some of you we might see at General Convention this summer in Louisville. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Right.